Hello and welcome to PostgreSQL, a weekly show about all things PostgreSQL. I am Michael, founder of PG Mustard, and as usual, I'm joined by Nikolai, founder of Postgres AI. Hey, Nikolai.
Hi, Michael.
And today we have a special guest, Tony from Cybertech, a Postgres developer there, who is responsible for, among other things, the PG Squeeze extension. So welcome, Tony.
Hello, thanks for invitation.
It is our pleasure. So today we are going to be talking all things PG Squeeze. Perhaps Tony could give us an overview of what it is.
So PG Squeeze is a Postgres extension that does similar things like the cluster command or the vacuum with the full option, except that it does not require the exclusive locking of the table. Well, in fact, it needs the exclusive lock only for very short time at the end of the processing, but it's actually a tool that lets users to get rid of table bloat.
Yeah, it's hugely powerful, isn't it? So online bloat reduction of tables.
Yes, basically that.
Yeah, big problem, and it's a really powerful tool, and I think a lot of our listeners will be familiar with PG Repack, which I think originated from Nikolai, you can probably tell me what it was originally called, a reorg or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. It's already doesn't matter. It's ancient name.
Yeah, but PG Squeeze, you also have like a bunch of other features, and it's done in a more modern way in terms of how. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how it's implemented and how long you've been working on it.
Yes, the motivation was actually to use. It was assignment. It was a task that I got from my employer, and the idea was to adjust PG Repack, the existing PG Repack extension, so it can be scheduled, so it can run according to schedule automatically. But when I investigated the PG Repack code, I realized that it's implemented in two parts. Part of the logic is on the server, and the other part is on client. And I realized that the client part is not really simple. It does some tricky things with connections. It even terminates connections at some point. So I realized that if it should be executed from background worker, it would be quite strange because the background worker would have to use the client library to connect to server. So the server would have to connect to itself over client over the libp library. So the fact that the client is not trivial made it almost impossible to implement the functionality in background worker. So that was one reason I thought it's better to start from scratch. And once I was considering doing everything from scratch, I got opportunities to do some things differently.
Yeah, just instead of replacing files, you decided to use logical replication, right? Because by that time it already became quite mature, unlike the moment when PG Rework and PG Repack was created originally. There was no logical replication yet at all.
Yes,
right? Is this right?
Yes, PG Repack uses triggers. Well, maybe I should tell shortly how both extensions work. The common part is that they copy the useful data from the table into a new table and then swap the files. Each table contents is stored in a file, so the extensions copy the useful data and then switch the links to the files.
Right. Also accumulating changes in some delta table and applying them. Yeah, this can be a headache itself.
Yes, right. And this is where PG Repack uses triggers. And around the time I was considering writing such an extension from scratch, there was a new feature in Postgres, and it was the logical decoding. I think the logical replication was not yet implemented at the moment, but I thought it could be useful for this purpose, so I spent quite some time studying how it works, and then I decided to use the logical decoding. I considered it more, I will say, compact, or I didn't like the idea to construct. The PG Repack somehow has to create the triggers, so it plays with the SQL with the DDL statements. It has to construct the DDL statements to create the temporary table as well as the triggers, and I thought this is quite complex and error prone, so that's why I prefer the logical decoding.
I think logical decoding should be lower impact as well in terms of overhead. So it feels like a lighter weight way of doing it as well to me.
Yes,
is that fair?
Yes, that too. Yes, I think the fact that it works at lower level in the stack should even be probably more efficient.
Yeah, because in case of PGRepack, any write during initialization of during this massive copy using, I think it uses create table as select. When we do it, all writes to this table also go to this delta table using triggers, and basically we write it twice and it goes twice to wall, while if we take logical decoding, we just extract it from wall and it's written once, right? This is already big difference.
Well, I think with PG Squeeze, the insertions into the new table are actually locked too. I think there's no way you could avoid the logging if the table was unlocked, but then it's hard to switch. I didn't go that much far in this direction, but
I mean, in our case in PG Squeeze, we just accumulate changes in the slot, and we don't write twice to two tables, right? This is the big difference in terms of how delta this delta is accumulated.
Yes, I see. Yes, that's right.
So this is obviously a difference, and I like I didn't realize that original idea was to be able to schedule it, and scheduling PGRepack means you do it on client using, I don't know, like regular cron or something. In this case, you brought all the interface to SQL, and we just can schedule it using pgcron or something, right? This is the idea. I didn't realize it. Or you can schedule it right with PG Squeeze. I don't know this. Okay, Michael is shaking head. I understand. Okay.
No, I'm saying you can. I'm saying you can schedule it within PG Squeeze. It has like a pretty much it uses the same syntax. It's cron tab. Is that? Yeah.
I see. I didn't know this. I'm not I used it only a couple of times manually somewhere very long ago. So. Yeah, that's great, and in general, be able to run everything at SQL level, it's good. I mean, not CLI level, but SQL level. It gives freedom sometimes, right? You can do it in application or anywhere, PSQL or something.
Yes, and
that's great.
And it's good for development and troubleshooting.
Yeah. That's great. Good.
Tony, I was reading. I think you have a super fan, previous Cybertech employee, Karel. He wrote a really good introduction post. I couldn't believe it was 2016. I mean, also it had lots of these features at the beginning. Mm-hmm. How's it developed over time, and how much have you had to keep working on it?
Well, I think there was not much functionality added since the initial version. I did some optimizations to avoid the restriction it puts on vacuum, because one problem is that the Xmin horizon, you probably know what it means.
Yep.
Oh, yes.
Must be prevented from advancing for some time. When the data is being copied, then this horizon must stay constant. It must not advance, and the other problem is that.
So sorry once again. So what exactly you did? Like if we create a slot, it already freezes our state in terms of horizon until we start consuming changes from the slot, right?
Yes, and I think the initial version did block this horizon for the entire processing, but at some point I realized that it's only necessary for the initial load for the copying of the data. Then it can be. Then it can be allowed to advance.
Yeah, when it's done. Right?
Yes, when you after the load, after the copying is done, you only need to process the changes that were applied concurrently. So you no longer need to block the Xmin horizon for this stage.
This is a huge problem for huge tables, right? If we have a 1 terabyte table, it means that this horizon is blocked for for long, and it affects the whole cluster because AutoVacuum cannot delete freshly dead tuples, as we discussed many times on this podcast. In this area, have you considered the idea of speeding up initialization? If, for example, we have regular integer 8 or, I don't know, like some numeric primary key, we could split the table into some batches or like areas, and then we could use multiple insert processes which would work in parallel, speeding up the initial load. Did you consider this, or this is like maybe?
Not really. I didn't have this idea. Do you mean processing the table in multiple iterations? No, I didn't get that far.
Mm-hmm.
So you say that with PG-Squeeze the Xmin horizon is a problem with the processing, or in general?
It's in general, when working with logical replication, decoding, it's a problem. Initialization is a huge problem. Sometimes we dealing with huge databases, we avoid initialization completely. For example, if we want all tables, sometimes we have like a couple of recipes how to convert physical replica to logical replica, just because initialization is a headache. It can take sometimes days, and during this time, Xmin Horizon is not progressing and AutoVacuum is blocked, right? So I know some tools, I don't remember, maybe PeerDB was doing this, basically virtual partitioning of the table, not real partitioning, but just like kind of partitioning, splitting it to pieces and then loading. If we have very fast disks and a lot of CPUs, a lot of cores, we can speed this process up, and this means that Xmin Horizon is blocked for a shorter period. Yeah, I think, we could consider in this product we could consider this. I think this approach, and PGRepack doesn't do it. It just create table as select, so it's a single process, and it can be slow. While here we have opportunity to speed it up, I think.
This sounds like one of the cons that we may discuss later, but yes, from this perspective, the PG-Squeeze behaves like logical decoding. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if consider this approach in future, if we think how to improve this, worth remembering that we need to synchronize all these sessions which perform inserts of individual of partitions, right, virtual partitions. We need to synchronize them using single snapshot, right? And so they deal with the same data. How it's called, I don't remember. When you start transaction, you can specify a snapshot, and there is a function which exports the snapshot name. So we can. It's like PGDump does this as well.
Yes, the PG-Squeeze also uses the kind of snapshot that is called historic snapshot. It takes snapshot of the database as it was at some point in time, but I'm not sure this. You need, for the snapshot to work, you need to make sure that the Xmin Horizon does not advance, because otherwise you must not lose. You should copy even the deleted tuples that are still visible to the snapshot.
Mm-hmm.
Because without that you will not be able to apply updates. If the tuple gets updated, you need to copy even the old version.
Right, but if the slot is created already, it should guarantee that the snapshot is not lost, right? I think so.
Yes, the slot does guarantee it, but I'm just explaining why we cannot advance it more than more than what is correct.
Also, Nikolai, I don't think this is as big a problem, because I think you're talking about logical like the slow initialization of a huge database, like the entire database, whereas
just one table.
But just one table, and we can be talking about partitions here though, right? Like if we're talking about you're talking about a terabyte table, if we could get it down into 100 gigabyte partitions, PG-Squeeze can work on a table by table basis and only blocking it like partition by partition.
Yes,
well, right, but if it's on partition table, this can be a problem, right? But on the other side, if we're dealing with huge bloat, usually a terabyte table means it's 100 gigabytes table, right? Because while we're copying it, it already squeezes, right? That's what's happening. Yeah. maybe this explains why this is not a big concern. And people should, you're right, people should partition the huge tables anyway. Yeah.
Anything you've had to do in particular around partitioning, Tony, or I guess it just works like any normal tables?
No, I think it's just normal. I only checked at the beginning the kind of table must be checked. I don't think that there's any special treatment.
Yeah, unless it's timescale DB. I remember there's an issue with Logical. There are hyper tables which kind of like partition tables.
Yeah.
With
they call them chunks.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and with regular partitioning, we just logical decoding works at partition level. That's it. Not that's it, but basics is this. And I remember there's some issue with timescale DB, so I wonder if timescale DB is compatible with PGSqueeze. Maybe there are issues there, actually.
Do you know, Tony?
I don't know, sorry.
No, it's okay.
So I just recently learned there are issues with Logical. We had a database with timescale DB. We needed to move it using Logical and also on the fly removing bloat, right? But it didn't work easy. So yeah,
good to know.
I have another question in general. So this is extension, right? This is an extension like PGRepack. Why extension? It could be not extension, right? It could be just some bunch of, I don't know. Like, is there anything that requires this project to be an Postgres extension? Because if it's not extension, you can use it anywhere. Even like there are managed Postgres systems which don't have even PGRepack. They don't have it. And people suffer from bloat. I mean, not people, databases suffer from bloat there, and I see it. And if they don't have PGRepack, they don't have PGSqueeze, we cannot use this approach, or we need to implement something similar ourselves. We're using logical decoding, right?
Well, extension is, I consider extension just a means of packaging, but what is important is that this code is a shared library, because it's C code running on server, so it must be shared library, and the easiest way to get shared library to the user is to make it an extension. So, does it answer your question?
Yeah, it answers. Yeah. I just think if for example there is a managed service provider, what should they add? PGRepack, PGSqueeze, or just PGSqueeze? Like, what's our recommendation to them? Because I know some managed Postgres service providers which become quite popular, and they lack this functionality, and they also don't tune auto vacuum by default, which means growing projects accumulate a lot of bloat, and they need some tools. So what do you think? They should just consider PGSqueeze as an extension because it's convenient, because it has SQL interface, right?
Yes, do you mean PGSqueeze versus PGRepack?
Well, yeah. So to me, a SQL level interface is an ability to schedule. It's an obvious advantage, right?
Yes.
And yeah. So I just it's maybe a rhetoric question. So no need to answer.
Yes, yeah. If you ask me, I would recommend PGSqueeze. But if someone likes PGRepack, then let him use it.
Okay, I have another question. We touched a little bit this initialization, and you mentioned some PGRepack constructs some DDL and so on. When PGSqueeze performs this initial load, is it possible, like theoretically, not right now, I understand like maybe right now it's not possible, but theoretically, is it possible, for example, because it's logical decoding, Postgres should obviously supports this. Is it possible to change some column type, for example? Imagine we had the primary key integer 4, and we want to migrate to integer 8. It's already not a use case of bloat removal, but it's kind of like
no
mutation of schema. Not possible, right?
No, it cannot. But I remember I was suggested this feature. It was suggested to me, but I think it would belong to a different extension. And one thing that makes the PG squeeze a little bit simpler than it might be is that it assumes no catalog changes. So it checks whether anything changed in the catalog, and if did, then the transaction is aborted and the processing is not effective. So everything, if anything changes in the catalog during the processing, then the processing ends up with error and everything's rollback. So if it should change the catalog in addition to copying the data, it will be more complex. And
so the main reason is simplicity, right? For the sake of simplicity.
yes, and I think actually it's different features. So I would put it into another extension. Actually, I wrote something similar. It's called PG Rewrite, and it tries to use the same logic or similar logic like PG Squeeze to partition table, to turn non-partition table into partitions. I'm not sure how much it is used, but it's another use case.
Yeah, I didn't know about this.
No, I didn't know about that either. I was just going to give you some context. This came up in a discussion we were having in an episode that we called Column Tetris, because that's what we've heard it called by lots of people. The idea of not just changing a data type, but keeping the existing data, like keeping all the existing columns, but changing their order for alignment purposes to minimize dead space in between columns. So putting all of the 16-byte columns together, then the 8, then the 4, then the 1, or so I'm guessing it's the same answer, but you could use the exact same mechanism.
Yes, the mechanism is another use case for this mechanism, but not implemented in the PG squeezing.
Yeah.
Is it can we use PG Rewrite for this, or it's only to make a table partitioned?
No, that PG Rewrite extension so far only handles the partitioning.
Mm-hmm. But potentially it could be used for this, like table rewrite for some reorganizational schema.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting. And also PG Rewrite, while it's doing this, it eliminates bloat, right?
Well, it basically creates new tables, so yes.
So bloat is removed. Doesn't this mean that PG Rewrite performs the same job as PG Squeeze?
Well, but it always needs one non-partition table, and it always creates partitions. So not all users that need to get rid of bloat also need partitioning. Also.
Yeah, I see. I'm just like noticing that this project also does the job of that project. Doesn't that mean that maybe it could be a single project? This is the idea. I don't know. I just see the need in this. Like sometimes we need to convert primary key data type, not only integer 4 to integer 8. I have tables right now where, for example, sometimes it was myself, decided to use data type text to store UUID values. And this is not a good decision, also because of disk space. And it would be great to convert it to UUID data type easily without headache, taking care of all the things that are required to achieve real zero downtime. For example, sometimes I see people create quite smart migrations, but then they forget about AutoVacuum running in transaction ID wraparound prevention mode, for example, right? And it blocks deployment, for example. It's like there are many things to remember, right? And such project, to be able to rewrite or to reorganize the order of columns and get rid of bloat. Maybe sometimes clustering as well. I know PG Repack supports clustering. I'm not sure about PG Squeeze to reorganize. Also supports, right?
Yes, you can specify index.
Mm-hmm. So there are many things, but they are united by the single idea that table should be basically rewritten, right? And partitioning is another use case. Maybe it should be a single. I'm just thinking.
Yes, the problem is that this would end up in say many extensions. Someone must maintain it. So I think ideal case is that this finds its way into the core.
Oh yes,
but
let's discuss this. Why not? Why not? Let's discuss this. For example, PG Squeeze. Why we cannot propose something like as an alternative to vacuum full and cluster commands? Maybe just an options to them, like online, right, or something. Zero
Concurrently.
downtime. Concurrently, doesn't matter which words, and everyone already receives this. Like, what are the obstacles on this path?
Well, the obstacle is a review, and I already submitted a patch which modifies the cluster command and the vacuum with the full option. Let's see what happens. So the patch is already in the commit fest.
Can you tell more about this patch?
Well, so far it does not contain the scheduling feature. That's something rather easy to add, but otherwise it's almost identical to the functionality is basically identical to the functionality of PG Squeeze, except that it does not change the visibility of the data. Well, if the PG Squeeze, when it writes the data into the new table, it uses new transaction ID. So the data kind of move to the future. Well, this is similar of what happens with the alter table commands. If alter table rewrites table, it also uses new transaction. So this is the documented anomaly of the MVCC.
I'm looking at this commit fest, which is called vacuum full cluster concurrently, and this is great. Actually, this shows how poorly I'm prepared for this recording. I'm sorry, apologies for this, but this is huge. I promise to look at this and advertise it on my Twitter and LinkedIn. This is great. Like, I think so many people would be happy to have this functionality in core. This is huge work.
Yes.
So basically, PG Squeeze in core, that's great.
I would be happy too, because I would not have to maintain the code anymore. And as I say, if it was incorporated into the core, then this visibility problem would also be gone. The extension is kind of limited. Some things happen lower in the stack, so the extension must use the new transaction to insert the data. But if it were incorporated in the core, then it would act just like cluster and vacuum full. These commands do not change visibility.
Mm-hmm. And what is the current status? It waits for review, I see, right? So
yes.
So
yes,
version 6 already, right? So there's already some progress. Some reviews happened, and it waits for another round of reviews, right?
Yes, that it seems so. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. So, well, I'm excited to see this. I don't know.
Okay,
that's
thanks.
great.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I did a couple of hours of research and didn't find that, Nikolai. So don't beat yourself up. Tony, though, I've got bad news for you. I think you probably are still going to need to maintain PG Squeeze for a while, because the scheduling stuff looks really useful. And I imagine I'm looking at the list of features, and you might have got the wrong impression listening to this, that you value simplicity, that it might not be that powerful and might not have that many features. But there's so many features to PG Squeeze, things that I wasn't expecting to see. Like, it does Nicola will be happy about this. It does analyze on the table afterwards by default. You can skip the analyze. I saw that was a feature, but by default it runs analyze on it. And you can even switch to table space. So you can, when rebuilding, I know not many people use table spaces these days, but that's a feature. And I learned something new. I didn't realize the heap of a table could be in a different table space to the indexes. That blew my mind. So I learned quite a lot reading your very thorough README, which was great.
Well, I'm not sure how many people use these features, but when I was writing it, I tried to do it in general way. So, and especially the analyze is necessary because it is needed to evaluate if there is the bloat, if the bloat exists. So that's basically why it analyzes the table. Or maybe not. I'm not sure.
I think it's analyzed after.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry that I was wrong now. I don't remember why exactly.
You don't remember why you added such a good feature. I like it.
Yeah, speaking of table spaces, I think there's maybe not huge, but there is some potential that this is old stuff. Like we used table spaces when like before cloud, basically, because some disks were fast and expensive, some disks were slow and cheap. So we tried to organize the storage. What I'm thinking right now in cloud era, it looks like table spaces use of them like almost disappeared. But if we think about tiered storage, which might get popularity over time quite soon, for example, if we store huge heap, huge table on object storage on S3, just because it's like much cheaper, right? We might decide, okay, we want indexes on, or at least some indexes on a regular disk. I mean, EBS volume, for example, right? I don't know, like it's just my fantasy, but it might have some chances to happen, to be popular in some cases. I don't know. So yeah,
another different extension. Tony, there's one more cool feature of PG Squeeze that I liked. There's various monitoring tables. There's a log of the jobs that have run and an errors table, which I thought was extremely good, and it does retry. It can do retries as well. I think it doesn't by default, but you can set up several retries. That all seems to me really powerful in terms of, you know, as you say, if you're unlucky and a DDL command happens to be run on the table just as it was kicking off one of these squeeze jobs and it gets cancelled, you might want it to be able to retry again quite soon. So these features all seem cool, and the idea of an error log as well, in terms of like having that as a table and having a SQL interface to it, all seemed really cool. I think that was all from the beginning. So do you remember much about implementing those and what you were thinking at the time?
Well, the monitoring, for me, it was even important for the development and testing. And I think yes, I wanted to, yes, I think one reason was to make sure that those, say, concurrent changes, I mean, that do actually happen during the test. So when the data is being copied to the news file, some applications may do changes. I call these concurrent changes, and I wanted to make sure that during testing these changes really happen. So that was one reason I added the monitoring. But of course, it should be useful for the users. If, for example, it takes too long time, it's good to know how many rows were already copied and what was the progress.
Yeah, I loved it. The only thing I was surprised that you didn't include, I don't think people necessarily need it, but it shows off how much work you're doing, is it didn't show me a before and after in terms of like table size. I thought there was an opportunity there to show off and show how much success you're bringing. But yeah, it shows the number of tuples on the initialization, or maybe number of rows, and then number of concurrent inserts, updates, and deletes. Maybe I think there's like 4 columns. Yeah,
that's it.
Cool. Well, what are your what's the future of PG Squeeze? I guess the core stuff makes sense.
I don't really think much. I don't really think that far, but then it will be maintained for some time, and the next step then might be to submit a patch for the scheduling. But I'm not sure if the scheduling is appropriate for the Postgres core. I think then if this was merged into the core, then I think people would bring up many new ideas. So I didn't really think that far. I think there is not many features to be added. I don't have many ideas what else should be added. And at this point, I'm not too eager to to add new features because it works. And as I hear sometimes that some important customer is using it, then I tend not to touch it anymore. I did the coding the best way I could do, but with the positive feedback, I tend to not add new features. I'm fine if I'm only supposed to maintain it.
Yeah. Like for new major versions, I'm guessing there's some work.
Yes, and updated for major Postgres versions.
Nice. Nikolai, anything else you wanted to ask?
No, I think we're good. Thank you so much for coming and explaining how it was created and how it's going. And I'm super excited, like with this surprise that there is a proposal to have vacuum full concurrently. It's really great. Going to look at it closer.
Okay, thanks for the feedback.
This is like, if it succeeded, it's a logical step for this project, I think, right? Which can influence every Postgres instance. Right?
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, best of luck. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope you have a good week.
Yes, thanks for the invitation, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You too. Bye.